Hello, guys. I saw that there was some interest into toxic relationships, understanding toxic relationships, and escaping toxic relationships. And I know a lot about toxic relationships, so I'm gonna explain a lot of the basics. So we're gonna talk about toxic relationships. The first thing is, what is a toxic relationship? A toxic relationship, in a sense, is a relationship which should be about love but is not about love. Okay, that's a toxic relationship. You're basically, you want to feel loved, you want to give love, but it just doesn't feel like that at all. And the underlying basis of a toxic relationship, that one or both are have an inability to create joy and love for themselves. So if one person within the toxic relationship is unsatisfied, I'm not talking about unsatisfied within the relationship. I mean unsatisfied about themselves in general. So for example, they don't know how to create joy. They don't know how to feel that they are loved. Um, they will project it onto the partner, and they will make the partner responsible unless they're very conscious, and they will make the partner responsible for their misery. And so when you start to complain, for example, about someone, you're in effect saying, I have, I don't have the ability to be joyful for myself. And so I make you responsible for the lack of my joy. And in a sense, I call this toxic meta framing if somebody puts someone else down because of that. And it comes from libido suppression or sacral chakra suppression. That's the second chakra. This is about joy and sexuality. So let's say let's say I'm becoming frustrated at work. I'll just give you an example. I'm becoming frustrated at work. My wife doesn't give me enough sex, and I feel also not very joyful in life. I don't feel like I'm fulfilling my soul plan, my soul mission. I'm maybe close to burnout, whatever. And I just hate my work, or I just don't like it. Then I come home, and instead of being happy about, my wife being there, um I start to make her responsible, if I'm unconscious, that I'm not in my joy. So I'll start complaining about what she does. And in order to feel better about myself, I'll start to put down the other person. And that's toxic metaframing. Basically, for example, what have you been doing all day? You've done nothing, I just work, you spend the money, blah blah blah. And um by the way, facts don't have to be toxic metaframing. It's just a question of, facts are usually not toxic metaframes, but it depends also a lot if how it's worded. Toxic metaframes can be verbal, non-verbal, indirect, and direct. So, for example, "you are stupid" is a direct toxic metaframe, verbal toxic metaframe. "Nothing you do is right" is a toxic metaframe. And as soon as somebody toxic metaframes you, they are not coming out of a place of love. They just want you to feel bad. And they want you to feel bad so they feel better about their life. And they make you responsible for not feeling in that joy. So, how do you escape this kind of thing? Well, first, you need to completely recognize it for what it is. And oftentimes, there's something called codependency, which is where it's one person is toxic metaframing, but the other person is, for example, loving them from the heart, but the other person toxic metaframing, and they have a push-pull dynamic where sometimes they're nice, sometimes they're toxic metaframing, and that then turns into a narcissistic behavior. And unless you're super conscious, you are not even aware of what's going on. So you, for example, the person will tell you, you never do this right, or you're always like this, blah blah blah. And then you start to feel bad, and when you start to withdraw, they'll be like, they make a joke, or they'll be funny, or they'll pull you in with, oh, I didn't mean it like that, or I only want the best for you, and so forth. And then the whole process starts again. It's a very, very narcissistic, disgusting behavior. And it's important to recognize it first. Now, when somebody gives facts and says like, hey, if you want to have, if you want to have this in life, you need to do maybe this, then it's not a toxic metaframe. But if they say like, oh, nothing that you will ever do will work, then it's a toxic metaframe. And you will start to learn to feel toxic metaframes. And I call them toxic metaframes. I actually coined the term because toxic metaframing is basically putting a frame over you, and it's toxic because it makes you feel bad and suppresses you down. It's supposed to, it comes from a sexual hierarchy need, because if I don't have opportunities, if I don't have joy, you shouldn't have it as well. And it can be very subtle and unconscious. Many times people who do this are not aware of it. The opposite of toxic metaframing, by the way, is compliments, giving compliments. And so anytime a relationship is only based on toxic metaframing or turns into toxic metaframing, it's basically a doomed relationship. If it's based on compliments, genuine small compliments, it's actually a very good relationship. Unless someone is so traumatized that they can't deal with compliments. And so there's only two ways to escape a toxic relationship based on toxic metaframes. By the way, anything physical is also toxic metaframe. It's actually saying your health is not worth anything. Mine is worth more. So you should never accept physical attack in any form or shape, not even verbal attack in a lot of ways. So there's only two ways. You reflect them to what they're doing. You explain them toxic metaframing the way I'm explaining it. If they're not conscious enough to see it, usually when they're not conscious enough, they'll start to get even more aggressive, and they'll start to play the blame game, blame it on you, make you feel guilty. For example, my father does a very interesting game, toxic metaframe game, where he says, well, I don't have problem with people. I actually get along with people very well. You have a problem with people, so you should think about your behavior. Things like that. So it's basically a form of very heavy gaslighting. And so learn how to spot it. First, you have to spot it. And the second thing is, when the person gets more aggressive, when you reflect to them that there's toxic metaframing, then I recommend complete physical withdrawal, completely cut off physical or any kind of ties with the person. You're going to be much better off in the long run. And it has to do with self-empowerment. The reason why a lot of people end up in codependency is because they're fearful that they cannot make it on their own, which is a lie. They tell themselves just to make themselves more comfortable, because a lot of time in this codependency, you get something off the other person. For example, what I see a lot is relationships where the guy is toxic, but the woman stays in the relationship because he's offering, for example, money, comfort. She can be lazy, and so she accepts the toxic metaframing. It's one way of codependency. There's different ways of codependencies. He never accepts her. She feels like never enough validated, but feels like she wants to, you know, she feels like a minority complex, so she feels she needs to be with him until he accepts her, and things like that. Very, very interesting stuff. So the more conscious you become, the more you see these dynamics. And you want to make sure that you recognize them, because once you recognize them, once you recognize toxic metaframing, this is something interesting about toxic metaframing. Once you understand and recognize toxic metaframing, you will be released from all toxic relationships, because at the heart of the toxic relationship is always toxic metaframing. And again, toxic metaframing, just one more time explained, in the sacral chakra, the person is suppressing their libido, which means their joy and sexuality. And by the way, if two people are very conscious, they can sit down and be like, listen, I don't feel enough joy. And you need to clarify for yourself what you need to be joyful, whatever it is. And the partner needs to do that for themselves as well. And then they come together and they say, okay, I need this for my joy. You need this for your joy. Let's do what is necessary for us to feel joyful. It doesn't have to be together, but it needs to be genuine for oneself. Because if I'm truly in my joy and my partner is truly in her joy, then there is no need for toxic metaframing. So, so there is an opportunity, if both are highly conscious, to go in this open discussion about joy and sexuality. Am I receiving what I want in sexual terms? Am I receiving what I want in joy terms? And if both come together, the sacral chakra works perfectly, and then there is no need for toxic metaframing, because you're actually happy. Comes always out of a deep feeling of being unhappy. So so that needs to be fixed up front, and then the relationship can be healthy. If the partner is not conscious and becomes aggressive, starts with guilt, shame, and all of this stuff, then it's better to cut with them. And there's no way they're going to change. There's literally no way, because you need to be at a certain consciousness level to see what you're doing. So let's say you were toxic to me, you were toxic metaframing in a relationship. I can go and say, like, listen, it seems like you're not in your joy, and or you are suppressing your sexuality. What are you missing? And because you're doing that, you're actually toxic metaframing me, and explain them what toxic metaframing is, and then say, you need to figure out for yourself what gives you joy. I do it for myself. And then we can come together again in a healthy relationship and give each other compliments, which is the opposite of toxic metaframing. So then it works. But if you reflect it to them, then usually what happens in 99% of the cases, because most of people who do this are not conscious, that person will attack you even more. They will say, look, I'm fine, I'm okay, it's your problem. I'm actually feeling very good. I don't have a problem in life. No, I'm actually very, positive person. And whatever, they'll figure something out, and then they'll re-attack you. And then you'll start to close down, okay? You start to withdraw. And then they'll be like, again, like very funny, or kind of like trying to pull you back in, and be like, oh, hey, I didn't mean it like that. And then the whole codependency thing starts again. And breaking out of that cycle can take a very long time, until you yourself become conscious of what's going on. And I've helped many people just by doing these YouTube videos, because they're like, oh my fucking God, toxic metaframing. Now I understand the basis of a toxic relationship and why it has been happening. And it just helps people tremendously avoid toxic people right from the very beginning. I go so far to say that 80% of people nowadays are toxic and toxic metaframers. They don't even recognize it. So you can just stick with the 10 to 20% that are not, and your life is just going to be so much better. And once you understand toxic metaframing very, very deeply, you'll come into the situation which I'm in, that already in the first few sentences you recognize what's going on. And there's many, 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 many different ways of toxic metaframing. Let me give you a couple of examples and a small definition. So you have the indirect, the direct, the verbal, and the non-verbal. Thank you for telling me that you've just discovered my channel. So the verbal, the non-verbal, the direct, and the indirect. I give you a direct non-verbal toxic metaframe. For example, I remember I was at the post office, and I came on because it was a different country, and I asked because people were standing in the line, and I was like, how long are you guys waiting? I just wanted to know if I should be standing there as well and wait. And the woman, a little bit older woman, and this is also important, it doesn't matter your age. You can be toxic at 10, you can be toxic at 70. It really doesn't make a difference. She was around 60, 70, and she was looking at me like, and she didn't even say anything. That's an indirect, this is a direct nonverbal toxic metaframing. It's telling you, I'm more important than you are. I'm judging you. I'm trying to put you down the way I look at you. Okay. And over time, you start to understand when somebody means this seriously, or when it's just, out of effect, like a short kind of like thing. But if it's somebody does it continually, it becomes narcissism. And so narcissism, in a lot of ways, and the definitions are not correctly understood by many people. Narcissism actually is continued toxic metaframing without an ability to self-reflect. A lot of people don't understand that. And where does narcissism come from? From a deep-seated trauma that is so deep-seated that the person is afraid to look at themselves because there's so much sadness and trauma. And they'll play that program until death. There's no space for consciousness in the narcissist to recognize what they're doing. And unless everybody withdraws from them, and then they sometimes say, okay, maybe I did something wrong. But because they're so good in playing with people, they usually never left alone, because they're maybe funny. They have something that draws people in and then beats them down, draws them in, beats them down. It's very, very horrible. So and the narcissist will never see it as something bad, because they genuinely think they're good people. Okay, that's important. So so you have these 4 types of toxic metaframes, and I give you a couple of examples. One was the looking, like this, the looking. And it happens in families, even when supposedly loving families, it happens in supposedly loving relationships. The thing is, they're not really loving, they're pretending to be loving, and that's a huge difference. So when I tell you, for example, you come to me and I'm like, and you tell me, let's say I'm your father, okay, and you come to me and you give me your like your grade, and the grade is like a C plus, okay, and as a father, I could be like, oh, that's not so good, but I'm sure you'll do better next time. Maybe I can help you, or we'll figure it out somehow, whatever. Or you come to the father and the father says like, you'll never amount to anything, this is shit. Okay, that's a huge toxic metaframe, because it's putting a frame over your son and trying to suppress him. And it doesn't come from the idea of helping and loving the child. It comes from the deep-seated unhappiness, lack of joy, and sexuality in the libido of the father. Because usually people think they need to sacrifice their own joy, their own sexuality, in order to live. And so that's why when everybody's sacrificing themselves and not coming into their joy, they'll project it to the outside. They'll find someone, and ideally within the family, because then the dynamic can play out every day to make someone else blame for their misery. And a lot of times this happens also because of lack of communication. Because if the other person cannot communicate what really bothers them in their life, and they don't know how to create joy in their life, they don't communicate it. It's sometimes it bursts out. Okay, so after a few months, years, it bursts out, and people are like very can be very hurtful because it has been stored up for such a long time. My experience, and I mean this wholeheartedly, a toxic metaframer that is not conscious, who's not conscious, and you reflect it to them and they become even more angry and start playing the blame game and the guilt game, you have to disconnect from them. There's no other way. The horrible part is that you might be in this codependency relationship for 10, 15, 20 years until you recognize it. And the patterns only become recognizable when you're ready for it on the consciousness level. And you have to look at, I think the best way for you to recognize it, if you're yourself not conscious yet, is create so much joy and sexual energy. I don't mean you have to live it out, but create so much joy in yourself that the outside will start to feel weird if it doesn't conform to that joy. You will start to feel the contrast. So if for example, if I say right now, my biggest joy would be, to go skating, okay, or do something, or get an ice cream or whatever. And I feel this joy. And then I have this person next to me that is not making me feel good in the relationship. I'll suddenly they'll be triggered tremendously, and they'll start to even more toxic metaframe you, because they'll be like, how come they're happy, I'm not happy? Okay. So that's one way to recognize in what kind of relationship are you. I think if you're a conscious adult, the best way, the absolute best way within a relationship is sit down with your partner, both have a paper in their hands with something to write, and everybody writes down what they think would give them at that very moment the highest joy in their life and their full expression of their sexuality, whatever that is. We're talking about the sacral chakra, so you have always the joy in sexuality is connected in the sacral chakra. And when that is clarified, you can see which points everybody has to do that for themselves, and they have to be super honest. And it's going to be hard to be super honest. But if the other person cannot accept the things that you really want or need in your joy and sexuality, and they will again toxic metaframe you because of it, then just forget the relationship. So basically, if you got a couple of points and she or he has a couple of points, and then you talk about those points and you're like, what can we do together and what can we do apart to follow our joy and sexuality? And that's why some very healthy relationships that are very conscious and very loving, come almost like unconditional, allow the partner to do everything they want, they need to come into their joy, so that when they're together, they can enjoy their company without projecting that the other person is to blame for their unhappiness. And a lot of people come together, unconsciously start to compromise about their joy in the relationship, and then they'll start to feel like something in the relationship is lacking. Where what was really lacking was your inability to create joy for yourself. For example, let's just assume that you have no joy in life except for your partner. Like nothing, okay? Then when the partner starts to withdraw, you're going to start to play a narcissistic toxic metaframe game with them because you're blaming them for your worst feelings. That's why it's so important. That's why a lot of people say you have to grow when you're single, is because you have to learn when you're single to create joy for yourself. You have to understand what is really giving me joy and allow yourself that. And that is what a lot of people call also self-love. I give you a couple of examples now of toxic metaframes in different situations. It doesn't have to be within the relationship. It can be also much sooner. And the sooner you recognize it, the better. I'll give you an example. A woman stops me on my bike just a few days ago, 2 days ago. She stops me on my bike. She tells me she's a little bit drunk. She had like a beer or something. And she's like, hey, what are you doing here? Blah, 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 blah. So in the end, she gives me her number. And she's like, let's go for a coffee. Okay. And I'm like, oh, I would love to. I don't know anyone here, so why not? But I could recognize in her demeanor or in her gestures, I could feel like maybe she was expecting someone a little bit different. Okay. Which is okay if you communicate it a little bit later. I'll explain it. So I figure out, she gives me her number. I figure out she's on WhatsApp. So I send her a short message and I'm like, I have WhatsApp. And she reads the message and doesn't respond. And it's okay. But then 2 days pass and she still doesn't respond. She's not like, okay, thank you. I'll get in touch when, when I'm ready or whatever. And that, in a sense, this was my intuition, but you built an intuition on toxic metaframing as well. So I'll explain that as well. Is she thinks of herself better than you. She thinks she maybe deserves more, or you're not the type or whatever. And that's the reason she's not responding. She could be, if she were very mature and conscious, she would be like, thank you for letting me know. I'll get in touch when I have some free time, or just be in touch if she's not interested at all. But if she doesn't respond at all, it's basically communicating I'm better than you. And it's a very subtle toxic metaframe. This is not a big toxic metaframe because you don't really know her yet. It's a form of ghosting as well. And the moment you start to, there's a huge mistake a lot of people make. The moment you're like ignoring that feeling, that intuition, but you're still texting and you're still like, maybe a few days later, hey, how about a coffee? Then you made a huge mistake because you intuitively feel you've been toxic metaframed, but you feel like you shouldn't weigh it so strongly. So you're like, maybe this or that happened, whatever. And then you're like, okay, let's see if we can go out. But here's the problem. The person might be nice in some way. So you might have a coffee and it might be okay. And you might even, sleep with them or something. But the problem is that you're, in a sense, started a relationship. I don't mean necessarily a romantic relationship. Could be a friendship, whatever. that you start a friendship, a connection with someone who's actually a toxic person, a toxic metaframer. And this is what I mean by recognizing toxic metaframes very, very, very quickly. Because the quicker you recognize it, the more you can avoid these people. And like I said, more than 80% are toxic metaframes. I have a yoga teacher who is exactly the opposite. She's not a toxic metaframer. She gives compliments. She's part of the 10% that I call non-toxic metaframers or non-toxic people. And I'll just stick to her. And I noticed all of the other yoga teachers that I visited, or many, not all, are actually toxic metaframers. I'll give you an example of another toxic metaframe by a yoga teacher. These are small things that happen right in the beginning, and they tell you where it's going, okay? And this way, you're going to save yourself in the future from all toxic people. It's insane how well it works. So, I'll give you another example. So, you go to a class, to a yoga teacher, as yoga teacher is just the example that I personally witnessed. And it happened many times. And the class is good, you like it, but she's kind of like a modern woman. You can also feel that there's some maybe problems, trauma. I mean, I'm an energy healer, so I feel stuff. I can feel that there's some stuff in her going on that's maybe not resolved and stuff. Okay, but no problem. Love the yoga class. Chat with her, go to her after the class also and be like, hey, thank you very much, it was a nice class and so forth. She's super happy and nice. Then you have direct messages maybe after in Instagram, and she's also very nice. She thank you for coming to class, it was very good to have you, thank you for the thank you, blah blah blah. And you follow her on the Instagram, and but she never follows you back, although you've been direct messaging and you've been following her. And this is a massive indirect toxic metaframe. It's a non-verbal indirect toxic metaframe, because she, in effect, she might follow hundreds of other people, and maybe whoever, thousands. Maybe I saw yoga teachers that follow thousands of people, that she doesn't follow me. And whatever is in her mind, you don't know what's in her mind. It might be some form of, she doesn't like you, she doesn't think that you're worth following, she doesn't like men, whatever. The reasons could be endless. But in a sense, it's a toxic metaframe, because you're actually in direct contact with her, and you have built a connection just by messaging back and forth, by being also a client, but she doesn't feel that she needs to follow you back. And I've seen this many times. And this comes, you're never gonna know what's really happening in that person's mind, but on a deep unconscious level, it actually is saying, I'm more important than you are, that's why I'm not following you back. And this is something that people have to understand, that toxic metaframes can be very subtle in the beginning, but it's an indicator of what probably a deeper friendship or relationship would look like with her. Okay? And this is something that you want to avoid. And so many people do it because it has become a little bit in this society a status quo of behavior. So I recommend to you, if you're highly sensitive like me, if you're maybe even like in, you feel these energies and all of this stuff, you learn how to deal with that, and how to spot it, because then you're going to have a totally different life. And I really avoid all kinds. I give you another example. This woman who rented me this place for these few days, she was super nice to me. Like most French people are very, very nice superficially in the beginning and so forth. Like bonjour, blah, blah, blah. She was very, very nice. And we had a very good energy field together. I know, as an energy healer, as a tantra master, I know that we have this excellent energy field. And she touches me, I touch her a lot, almost like Spanish, like touch. And I ask her, is there I sent her a message through Airbnb, and I was like, is there a gym nearby where I could do some, training? And I said, hey, if you want, she already knew that I'm a masseur. Also, I told her, if you want, I'll give you a free massage at any time you want. And she responded on the part where I was looking for the gym, but she didn't respond on the massage part. Now, here's the thing: if she's an adult mentally, okay, if a person is mentally an adult, she'll say, "I'll think about it. Thank you very much." But not responding is actually saying, I don't value, that offer. I think myself more important, and because of that, I'm not gonna respond. Okay, that's a toxic metaframe, and it's very important to understand because you can completely avoid these people. And by the way, she's single and a little bit older. And the more I look at this place, the more I see, kind of a couple of things where I was like, I think she's a bit strange. But by the way, it's if I don't speak to her directly and I think something about her, like I'm communicating right now, it's not a toxic metaframe. It only becomes a toxic metaframe when I'm directly talking to the other person and putting them down. If I said, for example, all Americans are obnoxious or something, that's not a toxic metaframe. My toxic metaframe is if I had someone in front of me, I'm like, you are stupid, you are obnoxious. On the internet, it's very common to toxic metaframe because most people on the internet that are spending too much time on the internet are unhappy. So they look for easy ways to toxic metaframe. You had a lot of young people toxic metaframe becomes it comes all through libido suppression. For example, here's a nice toxic metaframe. I have a Czech TikTok account, which it grew very quickly, and a lot of girls were starting to write me. And I noticed a lot of the guys start to become jealous. And so they start to say like stuff like, you can't pick the woman you want, you're bold, you're a pervert, whatever, things like that. Just toxic metaframe, just hard toxic metaframes. I blocked hard toxic metaframes instantly. And but when I don't react to that and I block them and I remove them, whatever, because they're so unhappy, they start to be even more toxic and they start to report me. So I'm starting to lose the account and probably lose it in a few days. And the interesting thing is that if you're in a society which is full of people that are not coming into their joy, but they see someone coming into their joy, living their joy and sexuality, they'll do anything to suppress that person, even deleting their account and their social media presence and all of this stuff. And even it happens when the moderator then sees this, they'll come into the same reaction. They'll come like, oh, we cannot allow him to be in his joy and sexuality. It's absolutely not okay. So we're going to delete him. And this is something super, super important to recognize, that the most people you will deal with are toxic metaframers. And the only way to go to be in your ideal energy field is avoid them completely. Completely. If somebody toxic metaframes me in any way, I just go away. There's no physical connection between me and them. Absolutely none. And you're going to feel so much better. And I absolutely adore having, these 10% people around me, these non-toxic people. It's just so much. It's so relaxing. It's so cool. And you just feel also safe within their space because they're not out to hurt you. And the toxic metaframe is really out to hurt you. They might say a lot of things. They might be even part of family, whatever. They are literally hurting your energy field. It's like this experiment about talking bad to plants and stuff. It's the same thing. So my advice is recognize it very quickly as soon as you can and avoid these people. And if you're in doubt, sometimes it's better even to skip it, because if you're in doubt, then maybe they're not that good for you. By the way, there is another toxic metaframe, which is also, it's almost like a legitimate toxic metaframe, but still a toxic metaframe. Let's say a girl is single, and you ask her out, and she says no. Unless she feels ultra unsafe within your space, or she feels like you're super, not her type at all in whatever way, it's actually also a toxic metaframe, because she's saying, I feel myself more important than you are to go out with somebody like you because of whatever reason. And it's actually also a toxic metaframe. It's actually saying, I'm more important than you are. And so you can actually, if somebody says no, you can actually be happy because you're avoiding a toxic person. It might sound strange because it's such a socially normal thing to say, sorry, I'm not going on a date with you. I mean, if you're, let's say, middle class, and somebody from the street that lives on the street comes to you and is like, do you want to go out, and you feel like, okay, there's too much of a discrepancy there, that it makes more sense, but it's still kind of a toxic metaframe. So it's important to recognize toxic metaframe in all of the different situations that exist. In relationships and friendships, for example, one toxic metaframe that I received, I had a friend, and this is how long these things can go. I had a friend who I was friends with, a teacher. We were friends 9 years, and I started the tantra massages, doing the tantra massages, and every time I talked about tantra, she would be like, she wouldn't say it verbally. It was a nonverbal toxic metaframe, but she'd be like, And once I talked to her about it, how she reacts, and she confessed that she doesn't, she's almost like not orthodox, but she's strongly Christian, and she was like, but she never experienced my session, so she never knew what it's about, and funnily enough, she didn't even value very much the positive things that I would say about my sessions. So when I recognized that it's a toxic metaframe, at that time I actually didn't know what a toxic metaframe was, but I could intuitively feel that this is not good for me. So I actually broke off our friendship, and immediately after I broke it off, I realized how good it was that I broke it off. And then I'd like to add something to this whole thing, is that spiritual awakening, through resting in silence, through abiding in the self, all these dynamics became visible to me. They were basically downloads which came to me in absolute silence. There was a moment, I think in November 2022, I was sitting again in silence, and then this message came to me about toxic metaframing, understanding it on a very deep, granular level. So if anybody knows something about, certain topics like toxic metaframing, libido suppression, libido empowerment, narcissism, it's literally me, because I understand it on such a granular level that I can instantly recognize a toxic person. Instantly. And also there's so many different social situations in which you can, feel those toxic metaframes. For example, guys do this also. Let's just assume this has happened when I was much younger. I don't go out that much anymore, and or almost not at all. But when I was younger, I went out. You would be in a club or in a bar, and you would have a girl or two and one or two guys, like, in that social situation. And it was more like maybe you didn't know each other, and it was more like getting to know each other and trying to be, maybe to bag the girl. Okay, it was more like a pickup thing. And I remember I was at a private party, at a birthday party, where there was this ex of the guy who had birthday. And I always found her very cute, but at that moment I didn't think much of, like coming together with her or anything like that. And there was a guy sitting next to me that I knew. He was older than me, 10 years older. And I was just talking to her very normally, but he had a very high libido, very, very high. And he was trying to bag her. He was trying to get her, basically. And I could recognize that she's not really going for it at that moment, at least. And he started to project his unhappiness onto me, and he started to toxic metaframe me in that situation. And mind you, the room was quite small. It wasn't a huge room, so I couldn't just physically really disconnect a lot from him. But now I learned how to do this, and I'm going to tell you how. Now, this is going to sound harsh, but it really is the way you should deal with these type of toxic metaframes from men to men in order to suppress the other person. You are not accepting toxic metaframes in no shape or form, because that would be the opposite of self-love. Okay? Number one. Number two, you decide to physical distance yourself from that person. So, because you don't want to seem like an absolute idiot and ass just leaving, you give the woman an option. Okay, let's say you're interested in the woman. Okay, in whichever way, doesn't need to be romantic. You can be like, this guy, you be super honest about it. This guy is toxic metaframing me. I'm not going to accept that. You could maybe use different words also. It doesn't matter. I would just use toxic metaframing. Now, you have the option. Um, do you want to continue talking with me? We go somewhere else? Or do you want to keep talking to this guy? Because I'm not staying with him. And then she has the option, and she can decide whether she wants the toxic guy or the healthy guy. And you're out of that situation. And that's something that this type of self-love is something that you have to learn, and it's an ideal situation to see where she stands. If she's going for toxic guys or she's going for healthy relationships, whether friendship or romantic. And this is absolute golden. Like, if I ever come into a situation like that, absolutely golden. I don't respect, I don't accept toxic metaframing by no one for whatever reason. And you will see that life becomes much, much better. The interesting thing is, you will become a little bit lonelier. And the reason is this. But it's a good loneliness. It's a healthy loneliness. Because most people will not be able to play games with you, so they will not want to be friends with you because they're not really your friends. A lot of people keep connections not because they want to generally be friends, but because they want to keep their ego alive and their narcissistic and toxic metaframing alive. Because I give you another example of a friend. He only calls if he wants to hear that your life is not so good. And the moment you talk about how everything is absolutely fantastic, he starts to like probe for possible unhappiness in order for himself to feel satisfied. But once I spoke to him about spiritual awakening, we never spoke again. Because he did something which is which I would call now a toxic metaframe. He said, I think it's a coping mechanism, spiritual awakening. I said, no, it's genuinely, I can be here, I don't need to be anywhere else, and I can be okay. And since then we haven't been talking. That's because the dynamic was the real dynamic has surfaced and was uncovered. And by that, his ego couldn't stand that dynamic anymore. And you're going to have that with a lot of people right from the start. They'll feel like, oh, okay, I cannot play with him. Okay, I cannot manipulate him. A little bit like the woman that stopped me on the bike. I think that because she invited me to a concert that evening, and I was like, I'm tired. I don't like concert even that much. I don't need the live music, but we can go for a coffee. And I think because she saw that she cannot manipulate me in the sense like she's not getting from it that what she wants in that moment, that she thought, I'm something better. I'm not going to be in touch with him anymore. Instead of being like, okay, I understand it. He just wants for the coffee. He doesn't like the concerts. Let's talk to him some other time. No, she made her mind up, thought that she's something better, and didn't want to have contact anymore. And like I said, there's many other examples of toxic metaframing. The list goes on. The worst is always hardcore generalizations in order to suppress you. You're stupid. You're dumb. You're never gonna amount to anything. You don't know how to do this. You never do anything correctly. You're like this person. You're like that person. Um, you're just like whatever. And I literally see how much it has become normal in society, how has become common in society to toxic metaframe. And some toxic metaframes are so hard that you cannot deal with that person at all. Like, for example, let's say you do something normal. You avoid someone. Okay, let's say you avoid a certain person and the person happens to be black. Somebody might call you a racist, okay, but you're maybe not. And but they'll be like, you're racist. That's of course a toxic metaframe if you're not, and if it's not a fact. And some of these things can have become such a norm in society, then it's very hard to continue any discussion with it. And notice also in public discussions, be it with famous people in podcasts and stuff, notice toxic metaframes and be very, very careful about it. Learn to how to spot them. And for example, I noticed that Andrew Tate constantly or very, very often toxic metaframes his brother. Very, very often. And it's a sign that he's a massive narcissist. And because there's a codependency, they love each other, especially Tristan to his brother, he would never leave. But energetically, just speaking energetically, psychoenergetically, Tristan would be better off without Andrew. But then Andrew also is not, the purest of hearts, let's just say. And I just give this an example of toxic of public people toxic metaframing other public people, and avoid these people. And if you yourself are a toxic metaframer, the best way to leave it is to become conscious of it and start to genuinely compliment people, because it's the exactly opposite energy field of toxic metaframing. You've done this very well. I think you dress very nicely, and I always do that. And if people cannot accept it, if they cannot deal with it, then they have an issue, because a nice short compliment is always okay, with the intention of improving the connection. You're not trying to get into bed with anyone. You're not trying to manipulate them. You just want to improve the connection. You want to have a nice connection. And toxic metaframes destroy the connection. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And I always find it fascinating how many people come back to me weeks or months later and they're like, it changed their lives just with stuff like that. Okay. Hear you soon.